Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and if you've never been here before, well, welcome. You're watching the Varietal Literature YouTube page, and Varietal Literature is a group of writers from Vancouver who like to have fun with narrative. What we're going to do today is just read old tales, because I like them. That's about it. If you like them too, this stream will work just fine as basically a podcast as well if you want. And you can just put it on the background, cook your dinner, or rest your eyes after a long day, and I will read you some stories. If you've never been here before, or if you're drawn in by the title of this video, you should know that if you're not watching this live, down in the description, there are the stories we're going to read and the time codes next to them. So if you're only here to find out a specific thing, such as what is this thing about paying rent and cookies, then you can just jump ahead to that story if that's all you want to hear. What we're actually talking about here tonight, well, we will cover the life hack of paying in cookies, which is actually a really funny and not too long of a story that I enjoyed. What we're actually talking about here is a Celtic conception of a kind of Garden of Eden heaven place. What we're going to kind of see is that it gets connected a bit by dream logic. So if you've never encountered that term, let me frame it a little bit. So dream logic is this idea that when you're dreaming, disparate things will connect, and while you can't explain why those ideas connect or how they're somehow the same thing in different versions, you very much feel that connection between them. So with that in mind, we're going to read a series of stories about the connections between things. I think you'll find that it's not always too clear that we're talking about the same place, but that there is an obvious common thread to it. So, Tir na Nog is an Irish conception, a Celtic conception of a kind of Atlantis, if you will. Although Atlantis was supposedly a much more substantial and non-mythical place to the people at the time. And the main stories we're going to read are from Yeats's collection, W.B. Yeats' collection of folk tales. And he has a whole section around folk tales he believes are discussing the existence of Tir na Nog. But I'm going to actually start because in that section, he doesn't actually tell the sort of founding myth of Tir na Nog, where it came from. And so what I've actually pulled up is another book by, I think, James Clement or something like that. I will get the name if I remember later, which I won't. Which is about Oisin. I know in our modern language, not our modern language, it's a modern language still. In our Canadian tongue, it looks like Oisin, but it's Oisin. We're going to read actually half this story. We're going to read about 4 pages of it because it turns into more a story of Oisin than it does about Tir na Nog, which is what I want to talk about. So we're going to read half the story of Oisin, which is not from the Yeats book, because it is the founding myth that the Yeats book is talking about and seems to assume you've already heard. If that's confusing, I hope you just use the time codes and jump ahead to where I'm actually reading the story, if that's not helping you at all. So this is not from Yeats. This is not where most of our stories are going to come from. But I'm going to read half of it because the other half of it is basically a different story entirely, where it just has the same main character. This is Oisin in Tir na Nog from Myth and Folk Tales of Ireland. By no one, really. It's traditional. There was a king in Tir na Nog, the land of youth, that's what it means, who held the throne and crown for many a year against all comers. And the law of the kingdom was that every 7th year the champions and best men of the country should run for the office of king. I will note there are a lot of unusual terms for probably most of our viewers here that I may have to pause at times to explain. So I'm sorry if that breaks the flow, but I think it's worth it. So one is Tir na Nog is the land of young or land of youth. Once in 7 years, they all met at the front of the palace and ran to the top of a hill 2 miles distance. On the top of that hill there was a chair, and the man that sat first in the chair was king of Tir na Nog for the next 7 years. After he had ruled for ages, the king became anxious. He was afraid that someone might sit on the chair before him and take the crown off his head. Oh, I see GS is here. I'm going to turn down the volume just a little bit. It's a little bit overpowering for me. I don't know if it is for you guys. He was afraid that someone might sit in the chair before him and take the crown off his head. So he called up his druid one day, magic user if you don't know that term, and asked, "How long shall I keep the chair to rule this land? And will any man sit in it before me and take the crown off my head?" "You will keep the chair and the crown forever," said the druid, "unless your son-in-law takes them from you." The king had no sons, but one daughter, the finest woman in Tir na Nog, and the like of her could not be found in Erin or any kingdom in the world. When the king heard the words of the druid, he said, "I'll have no son-in-law, for I'll put the daughter in a way no man will marry her." Then he took a rod of druidic spells, and calling the daughter up before him, he struck her with the rod and put a pig's head on her in place of her own. Then he sent the daughter away to her own place in the castle. Turning to the druid, said, "There is no man that will marry her now." When the druid saw the face that was on the princess with the pig's head that the father gave her, he grew very sorry that he had given such information to the king, and some time after he went to see the princess. "Must I be in this way forever?" asked she of the druid. "Aye, you must," said he, "till you marry one of the sons of Finn MacCool in Erin. If you must marry one of Finn's sons, you'll be freed from the blot that is on you now, and get back on your own head and countenance." By the way, that probably, I don't even know how we'd pronounce it in Canada, but it is quite literally pronounced Finn MacCool, which is Finn McCool, which I think is awesome. When she heard this, she was impatient in her mind and could never rest till she left Tir na Nog and came to Erin. When she had inquired, she heard that Fenn and the Fenians of Erin were at the time living on Knock on Ar, and she made her way to the place without delay and lived there a while. And when she saw Oisin, he pleased her, and when she found out that he was a son of Finn MacCool, she was always making up to him and coming towards him, and it was usual for the Fenians in those days to go out hunting on the hills and mountains and in the woods of Erin. And when one of them went, he always took 5 or 6 men with him to bring home the game. Oh, good. Big Drew just popped in and said that his COVID has receded. We were worried about you there, Drew. It's good to hear. On a day, Oisin set out with his men and dogs to the woods, and he went so far and killed so much game that when it was brought together, the men were so tired, weak, and hungry that they couldn't carry it, but went away home and left him with the 3 dogs, Bran, Scullin, and Buglin, to shift for himself. Now, the daughter of the king of Tir na Nog, who was herself the queen of youth, followed closely in the hunt all that day, and when the men left Oisin, she came up to him, and as he stood looking at the great pile of game, and said, "I am very sorry to leave behind anything that I've made trouble of killing." She looked at him and said, "Tie up a bundle for me, and I'll carry it to lighten the load off you." Oisin gave her a bundle of the game to carry and took the remainder himself. The evening was very warm and the game heavy, and after they had gone some distance, Oisin said, "Let us rest a while." Both threw down their burdens and put their backs against a great stone that was by the roadside. The woman was heated and out of breath and opened her dress to cool herself. Then Oisin looked at her and saw her beautiful form and her white bosom. "Oh, then," said he, "it's a pity you have the pig's head on you, for I have never seen such an appearance on a woman in all my life before." "Well," said she, "my father is the king of Tir na Og, and I was the finest woman in his kingdom and the most beautiful of all, till he put me under a druidic spell and gave me the pig's head that's on me now in place of my own. And the druid of Tir na Og came to me afterwards, and he told me that if one of the sons of Finn MacCool would marry me, and the pig's head would vanish, and I should get back my face in the same form as it was before my father struck me with the druid's wand. When I heard this, I never stopped till I came to Erne, where I found your father and picked you out amongst the sons of Finn MacCool, and followed you to see would you marry me and set me free. If that is the state you're in, and if marriage with me will free you from the spell, I'll not leave the pig's head on you long." So they married without delay, not waiting to take home the game or to lift it from the ground. That moment the pig's head was gone, and the king's daughter had the same face and beauty that she had before her father struck her with the druidic wand. "Now," said the queen of the youth to Oisin, "I cannot stay here long, and unless you come with me to Tir na Og, we must part." "Oh," said Oisin, "wherever you go, I'll go, and wherever you turn, I'll follow." Then she turned, and Oisin went with her, not going back to Knock-on-Ar to see his father or his son. That very day they set out for Tir na Og, and never stopped till they came to her father's castle. And when they came, there was a welcome before them, for the king thought his daughter was lost. That same year there was to be a choice of king, and when the appointed day came at the end of the 7th year, all the great men and the champions and the king himself met together at the front of the castle to run and see who should be first in the chair on the hill. But before a man of them was halfway to the hill, Oisin was sitting above in the chair before them. After that time, no one stood up to run for the office against Oisin, and he spent many a happy year as king in Tir na Og. At last he said to his wife, "I wish I could be in Erne today to see my father and his men." "If you go," said his wife, "and set foot in the land of Erne, you'll never come back here to me. You'll become a blind old man. How long do you think it's been since you came here?" About 3 years," said Oisin. "It is 300 years," said she, "since you came to this kingdom with me. And if you must go to Erne, I'll give you this white steed to carry you. But if you come down from the steed or touch the soil of Erne with your foot, the steed will come back that minute, and you'll be left where he left you, a poor old man." "I'll come back, never fear," said Oisin. "Have I not good reason to come back? But I must see my father and my son and my friends in Erne once more. I must have even one look at them." So she prepared the steed for Oisin and said, "The steed will carry you wherever you wish to go." Oisin never stopped till the steed touched the soil of Erne, and he went on till he came to Knockpatrick in Munster, where he saw a man herding cows. In the field where the cows were grazing there was a broad flat stone. "Will you come here," said Oisin to the herdsman, "and turn over this stone?" "Indeed, then, I will not," said the herdsman, "for I could not lift it, nor 20 men more like me." Oisin rode up to the stone, reaching down, caught it with his hand, and turned it over. Underneath the stone was the great horn of the Fenians, Baraboo, which circled around like a seashell. And it was a rule that when any of the Fenians of Erne blew the Baraboo, the others would assemble at once from whatever part of the country they might be in at the time. Interestingly, a common theme in myths, and one that was echoed in Tolkien with the Horn of Gondor. "Will you bring this horn to me?" asked Oisin of the herdsman. "I will not," said the herdsman, "for neither I nor many more like me could raise it from the ground." With that, Oisin moved near the horn and reaching down took it in his hand. But so eager was he to blow it that he forgot everything and slipped in reaching till one foot touched the earth. In an instant the steed was gone, and Oisin lay on the ground, a blind old man. The herdsman went to St. Patrick, who lived nearby, and told him what had happened. And I'm sorry if that interests you, that second part, but it really has nothing more to do with Tir na Nog in that story. So we're going to cut the story there. It goes into a whole sequence about Oisin being an old man and St. Patrick occasionally giving him power and then taking it away when it's convenient. It's strange, but that is the sort of founding myth of Tir na Nog. It's the idea that Oisin went to this land. How he gets there, we'll see, varies a bit. But just something to note, if you are a regular viewer of this series, the idea of being taken away to a kind of fairyland and time passing differently there is incredibly common. In fact, I think it was the Scottish fairy tales we did a couple of weeks ago had a story that was very similar, where a man was gone for 3 days and it turned out to be 3 years. And in fact, I will add a much less expected and significant connection here. We've never read it on this channel, but there is a series of translations done by a woman in the turn of the century who's half Japanese and lived with her Japanese father for many years of her life when she was being educated, who made English translations of Japanese fairy tales. And she has a fairy tale in there that is essentially the same story about a fisherman who goes out and saves a fish, and it turns out to be someone of significance that takes her down under the sea, where he goes to this castle and marries a woman, is very happy, but then wants to go home. And he also gets instructions. It's not the same. It's not a horse. He also gets instructions about how to, He's not told that time has passed in that version of the story, though. He's just told not to do something, which he does. And then he turns into a very old man. So it's interesting because we're going to see that theme repeated. We're going to see a place underwater in a second. And we're going to see... we've already just seen time passing differently. And, it being kind of a magical, mystical place of fantasy. Okay. Now, let's look at the main attraction here, which is Tir na Nog. So now we are moving on to Yeats' book, W.B. Yeats. Again, if you don't know him, he is a very famous Irish poet from the turn of the century. But he, one of my favorites personally, by the way. Absolutely love Yeats' poems. But Yeats created a whole collection, a kind of seminal collection. Here, I'll show you. It's one of the few that I actually have in text, which is a wonderful book. It's a really good book if you just are the kind of person who wants to read short stories here and there and that are a little on the odd side. But he has a whole section here on Tir na Nog. So we're going to read, we'll see how time holds out. We're going to read as many of the various accounts of what Yeats thinks is probably versions of Tir na Nog emerging in Irish, recent Irish history or whatever else, however you want to look at that. And it starts with Yeats's own summary of the tale we just read with a couple of more details. And it's only about a page, so I'm just going to read Yeats's summary of this section, and then we'll go into some of those stories. There is a country called Tir na Nog, which means the country of the young, for age and death have not found it. Neither tears nor loud laughter have gone near it, which is an interesting thing. The shadiest boskage covers it perpetually. One man has gone there and returned, the bard Oisin, who wandered away on a white horse, moving on the surface of the foam with his fairy Niam, lived there for 300 years, and then returned looking for his comrades. The moment his foot touched the earth, his 300 years fell on him, and he was bowed double, and his beard swept the ground. he described his sojourn in the land of youth to Patrick before he died, St. Patrick. Since then, many have seen it in many places. Some in the depths of lakes, and have heard rising therefrom vague sounds of bells. More have seen it far off in the horizon as they peered out from the western cliffs. Not 3 years ago, a fisherman imagined that he saw it. It never appears unless to announce some national trouble. There are many kindred beliefs. A Dutch pilot settled in Dublin told M. de la Boulage Lacon, who traveled in Ireland in 1614, that around the poles were many islands, some hard to be approached because of the witches who inhabit them and destroy by storms those who seek to land. He had once, off the coast of Greenland in 61 degrees of latitude, had seen and approached such an island only to see it vanish. Sailing in an opposite direction, they met with the same island, and sailing near were almost destroyed by a furious tempest. According to many stories, Tir na Nog is the favorite dwelling of the fairies. Some say it is triple, the island of the living, the island of victories, and an underwater land. So it's this land that either exists entirely underwater all the time, or occasionally comes to the surface and back down. That is a kind of place of placid peace. Not exactly joy and reverie, but also ageless. Land of the young. Oh, hey, look. We have our spam. Hello, spam. Hope your life is going well. And by well, I mean I hope you go to hell. Let me just report that. Unwanted commercial content and spam. Thank you. Go away. So, Tir na Nog, now if you are a person who wants, like, what's the more literal thing here, because it does come up a lot, there are some theories that basically it's high parts of the sea, that in rare low tides you can see land. That's one theory of it anyways. I don't really care about that, to be honest, but if you're the kind of person who does. So, the first story is the Legend of O'Donoghue. None of these stories are very long. The second one we're going to read in this section, though, is the one about paying your rent with cookies. So if that's why you're here, hang around. This is an account taken from T. Crofton Croker. So the Legend of O'Donoghue, with an account taken from T. Crofton Croker, from the book Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, edited anyways by W.B. Yeats. In an age so distant that the precise period is unknown, a chieftain named O'Donoghue ruled over the country which surrounds the romantic Loughleagh, now called the Lake of Killarney. Wisdom, beneficence, and justice distinguished his reign, and the prosperity and happiness of his subjects were their natural results. He is said to have been as renowned for his warlike exploits as for his pacific virtues, and as a proof that his domestic administration was not the less rigorous because it was mild, a rocky island is pointed out to strangers called O'Donoghue's Prison, in which this prince once confined his own son for act of disorder and disobedience. His end, for it cannot be correctly called his death, was singular and mysterious. At one of those splendid feasts for which his court was celebrated, surrounded by the most distinguished of his subjects, he was engaged in a prophetic relation of the events which were to happen in ages yet to come. His auditors listened, now wrapped in wonder, now fired with indignation, burning with shame, or melted into sorrow, as he faithfully detailed the heroism, the injuries, the crimes, and the miseries of their descendants. In the midst of his predictions, he slowly rose from his seat, advanced with a solemn, measured, and majestic tread to the shore of the lake, and walked forward composedly upon its unyielding surface. When he had nearly reached the center, he paused for a moment, then turning slowly around, looked towards his friends, and waving his arms to them with the cheerful air of one taking a short farewell, disappeared from their view. The memory of the good O'Donoghue has been cherished by successive generations with affectionate reverence, and it is believed that at sunrise on every May Day morning, the anniversary of his departure, he revisits his ancient domains. A favored few only are in general permitted to see him, and this distinction is always an omen of good fortune to the beholders. When it is granted to many, it is a sure token of an abundant harvest, a blessing, the want of which during this prince's reign was never felt by his people. Some years have elapsed since the last appearance of O'Donoghue. The April of that year had been remarkably wild and stormy, but on May morning the fury of the elements had altogether subsided. The air was hushed and still, and the sky, which was reflected in the serene lake, resembled a beautiful but deceitful countenance, whose smiles, after the most tempestuous emotions, tempt the stranger to believe that it belongs to a soul which no passion has ever ruffled. The first beams of the rising sun were just gilding the lofty summit of Glenna, when the waters near the eastern shore of the lake became suddenly and violently agitated. Though all the rest of its surface lay smooth and still as a tomb of polished marble, the next morning a foaming wave darted forward, and like a proud, high-crested war-horse, exulting in his strength, rushed across the lake toward Toomey's mountain. Behind this wave appeared a stately warrior fully armed, mounted upon a milk-white steed. His snowy plume waved gracefully from his helmet of polished steel, and at his back fluttered a light blue scarf. The horse, apparently exulting in his noble burden, sprung after the wave along the water, which bore him up like firm earth, while showers of spray that glittered brightly in the morning sun were dashed up at every bound. The warrior was O'Donoghue. He was followed by numberless youth and maidens, who moved lightly and unconstrained over the watery plain as the moonlight fairies glide through the fields of air. They were linked together by garlands of delicious spring flowers, and they timed their movements to strains of enchanting melody. When O'Donoghue had nearly reached the western side of the lake, he suddenly turned his steed and directed his course along the wood-fringed shore of Glenna, preceded by the huge wave that curled and foamed up as high as the horse's neck, whose fiery nostrils snorted above it. The long train of attendants followed with playful deviations from the track of their leader, and moved on with unabated fleetness to their celestial music, till gradually, as they entered the narrow strait between Glenna and Innis, they became involved in the mists which were still partially floated over the lakes, and faded from the view of the wandering beholders. But the sound of their music still fell upon the ear, and echo, catching up the harmonious strains, fondly repeated and prolonged them in soft and softer tones, till the last faint repetition died away and the hearers awoke as from a dream of bliss. I'm pretty sure we can thank Yeats for that description. That's very Yeats. You can say he edited it. That's Yeats. Okay, so what do we have here? Well, just to understand what this book is, these are accounts he's taken from people around Ireland at the turn of the century, stories that have been passed on in oral traditions. And so he's talking about this mythical place, Tir Nanog, and its different accounts and where it may have emerged. Now, the most founding myth we read first was Oisin going to the land for 3 years and it turning out to be 300 and coming back on a white steed and touching the ground and aging all at once. And then we didn't read this part, but then he is cared for by St. Patrick. In this one, we see a king, or a tribal leader anyways, as much a king of the past, O'Donoghue, actually doing a surprisingly biblical thing, which is just wandering off to his death, which is a thing in the Old Testament of the Bible, and I'm forgetting who it is, but I'm sure someone in the chat can remind me who it was that just sort of walked into heaven. I want to say Abraham, but I don't think it was Abraham. O'Donoghue is then seen at times, and it's seen as a good omen, to come back across the water and ride on this white steed, which apparently are the steeds of Tir na Nog. And that is most of that description. So, here's another account of what Yeats is saying is probably related to the idea that Tir na Nog is actually at the bottom of a lake, which is a common idea that we'll see a couple of times in here. And in particular, they identify what are essentially 3 large lakes in Southern Ireland, which are called the Lakes of Killarney now. There's 3 different lakes that make up this one massive lake. One's very deep, one's kind of distant, one is quite wide, but they're all essentially connected but split by various little reasons. And I guess you could call them the Lakes of Killarney. So, this story takes place near that lake, just like the other one did. And again, I think basically what Yeats is trying to say here is, was it Elijah? Yes, man, look how much I remember, as the one who walked into heaven. So we're going to see a little more comedic tale here, and this is the one that the namesake of the video is about, which is paying your rent with cookies, which kind of ruins the twist of the story. But hey, man. It's hard to get people to click a YouTube video, right? So this is also from Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, edited by W.B. Yeats. This is called Rent Day with no specific identified author. Oh, heads up. There is a lot of Gaelic and such in this that I may mispronounce at times. I did look most of this up and practice it beforehand, but I still think I'm going to do some disservice. But also, it means I'm going to have to pause and explain some things, because I think some of these passages will be straight up incomprehensible to a Canadian or American. Oh, Ullagan, Ullagan, this is a wide world, but what will we do in it? Or where will we go? Muttered Bill Duty, as he sat on the rock by the lake of Killarney. What will we do? Tomorrow's rent day, and Tim the driver swears if we don't pay our rent, you'll cant every ha'porth we have. And then sure enough, there's Judy and myself and the poor Growls being children, will be turned out to starve on the high road, for there never a halfpenny of rent have I. Oh, hone, that I ever should live to see this day. Thus did Bill Duty bemoan his hard fate, pouring his sorrows to the reckless waves of the most beautiful lakes, which seemed to mock his misery as they rejoiced beneath the cloudless sky of a May morning. That lake, glittering in sunshine, sprinkled with fairy isles of rock and verdure, and bounded by giant hills of ever-varying hues, might, with its magic beauty, charm all sadness but despair. For alas, how ill the scene that offers rest, and a heart that cannot rest agree. Yet Bill Duty was not so desolate as he supposed. There was one listening to him he little thought of, and help was at hand from a quarter he could not have expected. "What's the matter with you, my poor man?" said a tall, portly-looking gentleman, at the same time stepping out of a furze brake. Furze, essentially wild bushes, brake being like a hedgerow. Now Bill was seated on a rock that commanded the view of a large field. Nothing in the field should be concealed from him except this furze brake, which grew in a hollow near the margin of the lake. He was therefore not a little surprised at the gentleman's sudden appearance, and began to question whether the personage before him belonged to this world or not. He, however, soon mustered the courage sufficient to tell him how his crops had failed, how some bad member had charmed away his butter, and how Tim the driver threatened to turn him out of the farm if he didn't pay up every penny of the rent by 12 o'clock next day. "A sad story indeed," said the stranger, "but surely if you represented the case to your landlord's agent, he won't have the heart to turn you out." "Heart, your honour! Where would an agent get a heart? Exclaimed Bill. I see your honour does not know him. Besides, he has an eye on the farm this long time for a fosterer of his own, so I expect no mercy at all. Only to be turned out. Take this, my poor fellow, take this, said the stranger, pouring a purse full of gold into Bill's old hat, which in his grief he had flung on the ground. Pay the fellow your rent, but I'll take care it shall do him no good. I remember the time when things went otherwise in this country, when I would have hung up such a fellow in the twinkling of an eye. Those words were lost upon Bill, who was insensible to everything but the sight of the gold before he could unfix his gaze, and lifted up his head to pour out his 100,000 blessings. The stranger was gone. The bewildered peasant looked around in search of his benefactor, and at last he thought he saw him riding on a white horse a long way off on the lake. Was it Oisin? Was it O'Donoghue? Hard to say. But Bill thought it was O'Donoghue. "O'Donoghue! O'Donoghue!" shouted Bill. "The good, the blessed O'Donoghue!" And he ran capering like a madman to show Judy the gold and rejoice her heart with the prospect of wealth and happiness. The next day Bill proceeded to the agent's, not sneakingly, with his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on the ground and his knees bending under him, but bold and upright like a man conscious of his independence. "Why don't you take off your hat, fellow? Don't you know you are speaking to a magistrate?" said the agent. "I know I'm not speaking to the king, sir," said Bill, "and I never takes off my hat but to them I can respect and love. The eye that sees all knows I've no right either to respect or love an agent." "You scoundrel," retorted the man in the office, biting his lips with rage at such an unusual and unexpected opposition. "I'll teach you how to be insolent again. I have the power, remember." "To the cost of the country, I know you have," said Bill, who still remained with his head firmly covered as if he was the Lord Kingsale himself. "But come," said the magistrate, "have you got the money for me? This is rent day, if there's 1 penny of it wanting, or the running gale that's due. Prepare to turn out before night, for you shall not remain another hour in possession." "There's your rent," said Bill, with an unmoved expression of tone and countenance. "You better count it, and give me a receipt in full for the running gale and all." The agent gave a look of amazement at the gold, for it was gold, real guineas, and not bits of dirty, ragged small notes that are only fit to light one's pipe with. However willing the agent might have been to ruin, as he thought, the unfortunate tenant, he took up the gold and handed the receipt to Bill, who strutted off with it as proud as a cat of her whiskers. The agent, going to his desk shortly after, was confounded at beholding a heap of gingerbread cakes instead of the money he deposited there. He raved and swore, but all to no purpose. The gold had become gingerbread cakes, just marked like the guineas, with the king's head. And Bill had the receipt in his pocket, so he saw there was no use in saying anything about the affair, as he would only get laughed at for his pains. From that hour, Bill Duty grew rich, all his undertakings prospered, and he often blesses the day he met with O'Donoghue, the great prince that lives down under the lake of Killarney. So there's another story about Tirnanog. Which again, if you're just coming in, I see Holly just came in. Hello, Holly. Is a kind of Celtic heaven, a kind of Celtic mystery land, island. I guess it's not really of another plane exactly. But although time apparently runs different there, it's hard to say exactly what status is. But so far we've heard about Oisin's journey there and return 300 years later, and now we have O'Donoghue who comes around now and then and helps out the farmers, as we just read a story of O'Donoghue helping out a farmer. And that's the story, by the way, that is the namesake of the title. There's a life hack for you. Hang out at Lake Killarney when you are owing rent, and wait for O'Donoghue to come by and give you gingerbread cookies. Okay. Now we're doing okay for time. So, we're going to read, I will admit, a bit of a strange story. It's definitely got more Gaelic in it than the last one. We're going to keep increasing the amount of Gaelic here. Called Loughleagh, or Lake of Healing, which is about one of the lakes of, I believe one of the lakes of Killarney. It might be a different lake, now that I think about it. But it gives us the account that is the closest to that Japanese fairy tale version of the kind of world that we're talking about. It's also odd, but it has a really cool sense of humor to it that I found very charming. So I hope you guys like it as well. It's a little tough to keep up with the thread though, so hopefully you can track the story, because it's just to give you an overview, it's two guys talking to each other about the lake, and then one of them tells this whole story nested in their conversation. It's a little convoluted. "Did you see that bit of a lake?" said my companion, turning his eyes towards the acclivity that overhung Loughleagh. "Troth, and as little as you think of it, and as ugly as it looks with its weeds and its flags, it is the most famous one in all Ireland. Young and old, rich and poor, far and near, have come to that lake to get cured of all kinds of scurvy and sores. The Lord keep us our limbs whole and sound, for it's a sorrowful thing not to have the use of 'em. 'Twas but last week we had a great grand Frenchman here, and though he came upon crutches, faith he went home sound as a bell, and well he paid Billy Riley for curing him." "And pray, how did Billy Riley cure him?" "Oh, well enough. He took his long pole and dipped it down to the bottom of the lake and brought up on the top of it as much plaster as would do for 1,000 sores." "What kind of plaster?" "What kind of plaster? Why, black plaster, to be sure. For it isn't the bottom of the lake filled with a kind of black mud which cures all the world?" "Then it ought to be a famous lake indeed." "Famous, and so it is," replied my companion. "But it isn't for cures neither that it is famous. For sure, doesn't all the world know that there is a fine, beautiful city at the bottom of it, where the good people live just like Christians? Troth is, it is the truth, I tell you. For Seamus a Sneyd saw it all when he followed his dun cow that was stolen." "Who stole her?" "I'll tell you about it. Seamus was a poor gossoon, who lived on the brow of the hill, in a cabin with his old mother. They lived by hook and by crook, one way and another, in the best way they could. They had a bit of ground that gave 'em the pretty, and a little dun cow that gave 'em the drop of milk." Pretty, sorry. Potato. And considering how times go, they weren't badly off, for Seamus was a handy gossoon to boot, and while minding the cow, cut heath and made brooms, which his mother sold on market day, and brought him home a bit of the old tobaccy, the grain of salt, and other knickknacks, which a poor body can't do without. Once upon a time, however, Seamus went farther than usual up the mountain, looking for a long heath. For townspeople don't like to stoop, and so like long handles to their brooms. The little dun cow was almost as cunning as a Christian sinner, and followed Seamus like a lapdog everywhere he'd go, so that she required little to no herding. On this day she found a nice pickin' on a round spot as green as a leek. And as poor Seamus was weary, and as a body would be on a fine summer's day, he lay down on the grass to rest himself, just as we're resting ourselves on the cairn here. Begad, he hadn't lain long there, sure enough, when what should he see but a whole load of ganconers. Okay, so full pause. Ganconer. I couldn't find a pronunciation guide on this, so I'm sure I'm saying it wrong. But ganconers are a type of ganconers, maybe, or a type of fairy. It literally means, apparently, love talkers. They are known for having a pipe and for charming and making love to milkmaids. So they're sort of tenacious fairies. That's what you need to know. Dancing about the place, Some of them were hurling, some kicking a football, and others leaping a kick, a step, and a leap. They were so supple and so active that Seamus was highly delighted with the sport, and a little tan-skinned chap in a red cap pleased him better than any of them, because he used to tumble the other fellows like mushrooms. At one time he'd kept the ball up for as good as a half an hour when Seamus cried out, "Well done, my hurler!" The word wasn't well out of his mouth when whap went the ball on his eye and flash went the fire. Poor Seamus thought he was blind and roared out, "Mere murder!" which means 1,000 murders. But the only thing he heard was a loud laugh. "Cross of Christ about us," says he to himself. "What is this for?" And after rubbing his eyes, they came to a little, and he could see the sun and the sky, and by he could see everything but his cow and the mischievous ganconers. They were gone to their wrath and moat, but where was the little dun cow? He looked, and he looked, and he might have looked from that day to this, because she wasn't to be found, and good reason why. The ganconers took her away with them. Seamus Asnaid, however, didn't think so, but ran home to his mother. "Where's the cow, Seamus?" asked the old woman. "Ugh, Musha, bad luck to her," said Seamus. "I don't know where she is." "Is that an answer, you big blackguard, for the likes of you to give your poor old mother?" said she. "Och, Musha," said Seamus. "I didn't kick up such a..." Okay, I'm going to read this passage, and then we're going to go through and pick through what it means. "Och, Musha," said Seamus. "I don't kick up such a ball-out about nothing. The old cow is safe enough, I'll be bail, some place or another. Though I could find her if I put my eyes upon Kippings. And speaking of eyes, faith, I had very good luck on my side, or I'd never have one to look after her." Okay. Bullhouse just means fuss. So I'd never kick up such a fuss about nothing. Musha's mother. Kippings is sticks or twigs. So he's saying if I had my eyes upon sticks, I might be able to see him. All I can think is he's saying if I got more height. But maybe I'm wrong about that. And I'll be bail. I'll be bail for one reason or another means I must admit. Or I admit. So he's admitting that he doesn't know where the cow is. But she's surely safe. So don't make a big fuss. Also, I nearly lost my eyes to a ball. "Why, what happened to your eyes, aga?" asked the old woman. "Oh, didn't the ganconers, Lord save us all from all hurt and harm, drive their hurling ball into them both, and I sure as I was stone blind for an hour." "And maybe," said the mother, "the good people took our cow?" Good people is what they call little elves. "No, nor the devil a one of them," said Seamus, "for by the powers that same cow is known as a lawyer, and wouldn't be such a fool as to go with the ganconers while she could get such grass as I found her to be today." In this way, continued my informant, they talked about the cow all that night, and the next morning both of them set off to look for her. After searching every place, high and low, what should Seamus see sticking out of a bog hole but something very like the horns of his little beast? "Oh, mother, mother," said he, "I found him." "Where, Alana?" asked the old woman. "In the bog hole, mother," answered Seamus. At this, the poor old creature set up such a poolaloo. That was a word I could not find a pronunciation or definition of. So if you know it, let me know. That she brought the 7 parishes about her, and the neighbors soon pulled the cow out of the bog hole. You'd swear it was the same, and yet it wasn't, as you shall hear by and by. Seamus and his mother brought the dead beast home with them, and after skinning her, hung the meat up in the chimney. The loss of the drop of milk was a sorrowful thing, and though they had a good deal of meat, they couldn't last always. Besides, the whole parish fought upon them for eating the flesh of a beast that died without bleeding. Foft is like express dismay or disgust. I don't think it's even an Irish word, to be honest. But the pretty thing was they couldn't eat the meat after all, for when it was boiled it was tough as carrion and as black as turf. You might as well think of sinking your teeth in an oak plank as into a piece of it. And then you'd want to sit a great piece from the wall for fear of knocking your head against it when pulling it through your teeth. At last, in that long run, they were forced to throw it to the dogs, but the dogs wouldn't smell to it. And it was thrown into a ditch where it rotted. This misfortune cost poor Seamus many a salt tear, for he was now obliged to work twice as hard as before, and be out cutting heath on the mountain late and early. One day he was passing by this cairn with a load of brooms on his back, when what should he see but a little dun cow and two red-headed fellows herding her. As a note, while I have a drink of water, if you were to put flesh in a bog, that is what would happen to it. So I find it interesting that it is scientifically accurate. That's my mother's cow, said Seamus O'Snaid. No, it's not, said one of the chaps. But I say it is, said Seamus, throwing the brooms on the ground and seizing the cow by the horns. At that, the red fellows drove her as fast as they could to this steep place, and with one leap she bounced over, with Seamus stuck fast to her horns. They made only one splash in the loch. When the waters closed over them, they sunk to the bottom. Just as Seamus thought that all was over with him, he found himself before a most elegant palace built with jewels and all manners of fine stones. Though his eyes were dazzled with the splendor of the place, faith he had gumption enough not to let go his hold. But in spite of all they could do, he held his little cow by the horns. He was axed into the palace, but he wouldn't go. The hubbub at last grew so great that the door flew open, and out walked 100 ladies and gentlemen as fine as any in the land. What does this boy want? Asked one of them, who seemed to be the master. I want my mother's cow, said Seamus. That's not your mother's cow, said the gentleman. Berthashine, cried Seamus. Don't I know her as well as I know my right hand? Where did you lose her? Asked the gentleman. And so Seamus up and told him all about it, how he was on the mountain, and how he saw the good people hurling, and how the ball was knocked in his eye and his cow was lost. I believe you're right, said the gentleman, pulling out his purse, and here is a price of 20 cows for you. No, no, said Seamus, you'll not catch old birds with chaff. I'll have my cow and nothing else. You're a funny fellow, said the gentleman. Stop here and live in a palace. I'd rather live with my mother. Foolish boy, said the gentleman, stop here and live in a palace. I'd rather live in my mother's cabin. Here you can walk through gardens loaded with fruit and flowers. I'd rather, said Seamus, be cutting heath on the mountain. Here you can eat and drink of the best. Since I've got my cow, I can milk once more with the praties. Again, potatoes. Oh, cried the ladies gathering round him. Sure, you wouldn't take away the cow that gives us milk for our tea. Oh, said Seamus, my mother wants milk as bad as anyone, and she must have it. So there is no use in your palaver. I must have my cow. At this they all gathered about him and offered him bushels of gold, but he wouldn't have anything but his cow. Seeing him as obstinate as a mule, they began to thump and beat him, but still he held fast by the horns, till at length a great blast of wind blew him out of the place, and in a moment he found himself and the cow standing on the side of the lake, the water of which looked as if it hadn't been disturbed since Adam was a boy, and that's a long time since. Well, Seamus drove his cow home, and right glad his mother was to see her. But the moment she said, God bless the beast, she sunk down like the brisha of a turf rick. This took a little bit to put together. A few searches went into this. Brisha means broken, like broken in half. Of a turf, grass, rick is like a bale of hay. Or sticks, more commonly. So she sunk down like the breaking of sticks. That was the end of Seamus's dun cow. And sure, continued my companion, standing up, it is now time for me to look after my brown cow, and God send the Ganconers hadn't taken her away. Of this I assured him there could be no fear, so we parted. Ah, GS found it. Poolaloo. Crying together at funerals. It's like onomatopoeia. I don't know if you picked up on it, why the cow would have passed away that way. But I believe, I could be misinterpreting it, but I believe it's because the cow was in a land where time travels differently, right? And I think the same thing happened to the cow that happened to Oisin. Okay, so there's a story of a man who just is so infatuated with his cow and his simple life that he would not give it up for anything. And the way that I think we'll wrap up here is poems. There's a couple of brief poems here. We're actually almost directly on time, which is great. Now, Hy-Brasail is a place, probably one of the most famous iterations of Tir Nonig, which is actually not in the bottom of a lake. Hy-Brasail is a island supposedly off the coast of, I believe, southeastern Ireland, I think. And it's actually on certain maps, even though nobody's ever been there. There are claims of people seeing it, of course. So Hy-Brasail is supposed to be, again, an iteration of this Tir Nonig. Yeah, we'll just read the poem, which is an account taken from Gerald Griffin. Hy-Brasail, the Isle of the Blest. On the ocean that hollows the rocks where you dwell, a shadowy land has appeared as they tell. Men thought it a region of sunshine and rest, and they call it Hy-Brasail, the Isle of the Blest. From year onto year on the ocean's blue rim, the beautiful spectre showed lovely and dim. The golden clouds curtained the deep where it lay, and it looked like an Eden, away, far away. A peasant who heard of the wonderful tale in the breeze of the Orient loosened his sail. From Era the holy he turned to the west, for though Era was holy, Hy-Brasail was blessed. He heard not the voices that called from the shore, he heard not the rising wind's menacing roar. Home, kindred, and safety he left on that day, and he sped to Hy-Brasail, away, far away. Morn rose on the deep in that shadowy isle, o'er the faint rim of distance reflected its smile. Noon burned on the wave, and that shadowy shore seemed lovely, distant and faint as before. Lone evening came down on the wanderer's track, and to Ara again he looked timidly back. Oh, far on the verge of the ocean it lay, yet the Isle of the Blest was away, far away. Rash dreamer, return, O ye winds of the main, bear him back to his own peaceful Era again. Rash fool, for a vision of fanciful bliss, to barter thy calm life of labor and peace. The warning of reason was spoken in vain, he never revisited Ara again. Night fell on the deep, amidst tempest and spray, and he died on the waters, away, far away. And then this is just one very brief little section, which I think will wrap us up. This is called The Phantom Isle, an account taken by W.B. Yeats from Giraldus Cambrensis. Among the other islands is one newly formed, which they call the Phantom Isle, which had its origins in this manner. One day a large mass of earth rose to the surface of the sea where no land had ever been seen before, to the great amazement of islanders who observed it. Some of them said that it was a whale or other immense sea monster. Others, remarking that it continued motionless, said, "No, it is land." In order, therefore, to reduce their doubts to certainty, some picked young men of the island determined to approach nearer the spot in a boat. When, however, they came so near to it that they thought they should go on shore, the island sank in the water and entirely vanished from sight. The next day it reappeared and again mocked the same youth with this like delusion. At length, on their rowing towards it on the third day, they followed the advice of an older man and let it fly an arrow, barbed with red-hot steel, against the island, and then landing found it stationary and habitable. This adds one to the many proofs that fire is the greatest of enemies to every sort of phantom, insomuch that those who have seen apparitions fall into a swoon as soon as they are sensible of the brightness of fire. For fire, both from its position and nature, is the noblest of elements, being a witness of the secrets of the heavens. The sky is fiery, the planets are fiery. The bush burnt with fire, but was not consumed. The Holy Ghost sat upon the pulsals in tongues of fire. And that is all I have on Tir na Nog. GS says, I'll have a PhD in mythical literature after listening to all your wonderful fairy tales. Well, my complete lack of context is probably going to arrest that. Probably just saying things wrong. So, yeah, I mean, if you came here for the title, the Rent Day story was the one for you. But as I sometimes do here, I try to wrap things around a theme, and I found this concept of Tir na Nog very interesting. And as I said in the intro, the connections of it has a kind of dream logic to it, where it's not too clear what these stories have to do with each other, but they certainly have similar shapes and feelings to them. There's these repeated themes of sort of water and mysterious lands beneath them, and men on white horses that return at random and do wonderful things. We didn't read all of Ashan's story. If you want to read more of his legend, you can. It's bizarre, I will say. It gets a little racist and a little violent towards animals specifically, because he was a hunter. But, you know, there's still this idea of people coming from this land and doing great things, and this variation in how time passes there and so on. Is there any greater point to any of that other than just a point of fascination, that we all find the same things interesting and look at water and wonder what's beneath it? I don't know. But I enjoyed the stories, and I hope you did too. And I hope you get a wonderful sleep. And this maybe even helped you get there. Because this has been Fireside Fairytales. Thank you for everybody who listened and enjoyed at least one of the stories or poems. Thank you so much for GS Holly for coming in, and Big Drew. It's wonderful to hear you doing much better. If you enjoy this kind of content, but you want something a little sillier and crazier, we also run a stream on 6:30 on Thursdays, which is a lot more modern and silly, and where we actually write stories together live. It's a lot more fun than you might think. It's kind of improv comedy. Thank you so much, everybody. You get a good sleep in the cabin. I'll keep the fire warm.